welcome everybody to the first talk in the Environmental Praxis lecture series. Today we have Dr. Mark McLaughlin, who did his history PhD at the University of New Brunswick and is now an assistant professor of history and Canadian studies at the University of Maine in Orono. And I'm familiar with Mark's work because of his research focus on forestry. So I encourage you to also check out his work on forestry as well. Today he's going to be talking about the rise. The title of his talk is the rise of Comix, how the maritime governments have shaped environmental education. Mark, you can take it away.
I'd like to thank Tracy for inviting me here today. I have a soft spot for Fredericton. I'd much prefer if I could actually be there in person, but I guess this is second best in these, especially during these interesting times that we're in. So I really want to thank you for the opportunity for inviting me. If everybody's curious as to what's going on back here with the Canadian flag, I teach an Introduction to Canadian Studies course to about 70 students, and we haven't completely finished my office, so one of the sort of good ways to develop a backdrop when you're doing an Intro to Canadian Studies course in the US is you just throw up a Canadian flag, and then that kind of provides a little bit of ambiance and kind of gives me a little bit of bachelor chic or something for the students as well. So that works out. So before I get into the talk today, hang on here, let me share my screen. There we go. So before I get into this here topic, Rise of the Economics, how the maritime governments helped shape environmental education, I just wanted to do a bit of an intro and sort of explain how I got into this topic. Now I know, likely in some of your minds, there's this question, but wait, you're an environmental historian, so why comic books? Great question, everyone. I am an environmental historian. My research has focused on issues of resource management and resource science, and I'm particularly interested in sort of my geographical and time focus is New Brunswick, kind of the mid-20th century, but I've also done some work on, Canada east of the Great Lakes, East North America. And I'm very much interested in issues related to forestry, sort of access to forests, how does the state mete out access, that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm coming at from a lot of this sort of perspective. How did I get to issues related with comic books? Well, about 8 or 9 years ago, I was in the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, and I was trying to find a photo for an article that I was preparing for publication at that time. And one of the photo archivists brought my attention to this and said, this might be a photo that you're interested in. It's related to the environment. This was in the Department of the Environment files. When I saw this, I was like, oh, here's some literature that the Department of the Environment put out, great, whatever. But then, if you might notice, there's a comic book there, Capitaine Enviro. And I had never heard of this before, and it kind of, to a certain extent, really piqued my interest and sort of blew me away. I was like, what is this? What's going on here? Because this guy, whoever he is, he's fighting some aliens over the Maritimes, as you might see there. So it really piqued my interest, and it kind of got me going down this rabbit hole of trying to discover what this was all about. We're going to come back to this photo later on when the full reality of what this meant kind of occurred to me. Now, it wasn't as if I had not heard of, some sort of comic book hero that was related to the environment before. I grew up in the 90s, and some of you might remember Captain Planet from back in the day. Originally came out in the year 1990. This is a 12-issue comic book series that came out through Marvel Comics in 1991. So if you look at the top, I like to put at it that Captain Planet came out in 1990. Captain Enviro, the comic you saw earlier, came out in 1972. So I think of Captain Planet as a Captain Enviro copycat, not the other way around. So it's not as if it wasn't without precedent in some regard, at least from me. And while we all knew of Captain Planet. There are also other sort of less well-known instances of superheroes being related to the environment. Particularly, this is an example that it's the Connecticut Department of Sanitation, if I remember correctly. This is The Adventures of Ray Cycle, Recycling Superhero. How exciting is that? This came out in 1988. So it was really kind of piquing my interest, and I was, what's going on here? And it was during this period that I remember, growing up in the '90s and recycling in schools and that sort of stuff was a really big issue. And it was kind of during this period in the 1990s when sort of the environment sort of came to the fore again, or starting to come to the fore as an issue for a lot of people, for voters, citizens, and that sort of thing. So it was really kind of piquing my interest, and I was interested as to how this kind of played out in that sort of continuum. And it really interested me that governments were using comic books to pass on certain messages to their citizens or to school children. So, being someone who's interested in the state, that kind of in the environment as well, it all just kind of worked out really well and fit into some of the research that I did. So, getting into that, that's how I became interested in comic books to a certain extent. And then for today, I'd like to talk a little bit about why historians care about comic books. I want to talk about environmental education and then the maritime governments a little bit. And I want to then also get into that comic book specifically, because the sort of environmental education that emerged in an earlier period, in the 1970s in particular, was a lot of the messaging that then carried on into the 1990s and today. And there's a certain level of nuance within that messaging that was kind of developed, and maybe, I don't know if you'd want to say perfected, in an earlier period that you still see around. And to kind of really get at some of the nuance that's there, I think a bit of a visual analysis of Captain Enviro, some of the material culture that's produced during that period, really provides sort of a really intimate way of getting at that sort of nuance that's there. So why do historians care about comic books? Well, this might be the popular perception. They've always been kind of seen as children's literature, children's reading material. They stereotypically seen as people don't read good. This is what they go for, and all that. And sometimes I'll lecture at a retirement home, and this is the sort of some of the older folks who are there. They'll be like, "Oh, that was me back in the '50s or something." This is or the '40s. This is how they would remember comic books. But it's also something that is, it's like film. It's like anything else. These are it's material culture. It is sort of cultural products that society has produced in specific times. And if we analyze those and look at those, you can, to a large degree, get a sense of what's kind of going on in society, either explicitly or implicitly. And by about the 1980s, you had the rise of comic studies. This is a specific academic discipline that's related to people who are studying comics, coming at it from different angles, asking questions, taking comics seriously as something that academics can study and try to figure out. Why are comics there? What can they tell us, etc. This is the Comic Studies Reader, edited by Jeet Heer and Kent Worcester. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that just came out a few years ago. And particularly related to historians, a couple of the ways that I want to highlight about how historians might be interested in comic books. First of all, is as primary sources. So sources from, that were produced in the time that we might be studying. This is an example here on the screen, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. This was produced by the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1957, if I remember correctly. And this was a group that was involved in sort of the early days of the civil rights movement. And they produced this comic to try to get out the word of who this guy was named Martin Luther King, what was the Montgomery bus boycott all about, how to get out the sort of the message of nonviolent protest and civil rights and that sort of stuff. If you might recall, John Lewis, Representative John Lewis, who just passed away a few months ago, he talks about in his biography, which is actually a three-part graphic novel when he's related to the sort of the marches that he did back in the Civil Rights Day. In there, he explicitly talks about how he encountered, for the first time, really, to a certain degree, this idea of nonviolent protest and the story of Martin Luther King through this comic book. And it was actually quite influential for a lot of younger African American people who, here in the US, experiencing this story. So there you get a sense of what the time might be like, and what this sort of civil rights experience might have been. We also use comics in the classroom, using it as a teaching tool. This is a graphic novel that came out a few years ago called Abina and the Important Men, a graphic history. And it uses a primary source of an enslaved woman who was wrongly enslaved. And after she gained her freedom, this is in the late 19th century, she then sued in court the man who wrongly enslaved her. And so there was we don't have any record of her otherwise, but there is a court record there. And the people who created this graphic novel used the court record to create this graphic novel and sort of write out, demonstrate her story, etc. And at the back, they also give the primary source from which they base this upon. So you can actually see the sort of secondary retelling of the story, but then there's also the primary source there. So it's it's an interesting sort of teaching tool, if you will. Now that I've kind of established why historians care about comic books, just a quick history that, of course, there's precedence for the medium, but comics really, as a medium, arise as we know them today in 1938 with the publication of this comic featuring this guy, Superman. And from that point forward, comics, for better or for worse, were associated to a large degree with superheroes. They were great because it helped the medium gain a lot of popularity. But some people might point out that at the same time, it sort of forever after that, gave it the stigma of being children's literature or whatever. Always associated with superheroes, maybe kind of doing away with some of the sophistication, sometimes not allowing for that. So the medium rises at about 1938, big in the US. Canada getting a lot of US comics in those first couple of years. But you really do see the rise of a Canadian comic book industry for a certain period of time, particularly in the 40s, which historian John Bell calls the Canadian Golden Age. They often refer to comic books in ages that go with the sort of the ebbs and the flows of the popularity of superheroes. So the Canadian Golden Age, according to John Bell, is in the 40s, about 40 or 41 to 46, 47 in there. It had to do a lot with certain sort of controls that were put in place with the Second World War that didn't allow for the flow of American comic books into Canada, kind of created a protected space where Canadian publishers could produce their own material. And here's an example of sort of a homegrown story that was developed. This is Nelvana of the Northern Lights, often held up as the first sort of quintessential Canadian superhero. She's an Inuit demigoddess. We can talk about her more later. She's also sometimes held up as one of the first female superheroes. She actually came out several months before Wonder Woman did. And the Canadian Silver Age, you might not be able to see that too well, full screen's in the way, but from about 1975 to 1990, after the war, the controls that were taken off, American comics flooded back in, and for a range of issues, the Canadian kind of comic book scene died down to a large degree. And John Bell likes to say the Canadian Silver Age doesn't really, in the popularity of it, and the sort of publication base doesn't really pop back up until about mid 70s. And this is kind of heralded with the sort of the first issue of Captain Canuck. There was some other sort of activity that was going on, but this is sort of the first stereotypical piece that was produced during that period. But in between, it doesn't mean that there wasn't some sort of comic art tradition occurring in Canada. Sort of the two big subgenres, if you will, that people hold up are underground comics and educational giveaways. Now, underground comics, these are produced in the mid 60s to the mid 70s, and these are sort of countercultural. These are against the grain. They are featuring stories that go against the comics code that's out at the time. They got beer, they have sex, they have swearing, with all the sorts of stuff that young people in the 60s liked, and that, the parents told them they weren't supposed to have or do, so, and very much of a different comic tradition, not as straight-laced as in terms of the drawings and all that, more fluid, more colorful in some aspects. Then on the right, you have educational giveaways. And these were comics that were produced by governments, by corporations, by nonprofits, etc. And they were used to try to get across certain sort of educational messaging. And these were embraced by governments majorly in the 50s and the 60s to get across certain ideas to citizens, but also in particular school children, because this is a big thing. If you want to get across an idea about, in this case, conservation, a good place is to start with kids. You have them in a classroom, you give them some reading material. There you go. Maybe we can catch them, with this medium, this new thing called comics. So this one here on the right, for future generations, the National Parks of Canada. This is all about conservation and the national parks. So that's a little bit about comic books. Let's get into this idea of environmental education. So the comic book industry is developing to a certain degree in Canada, but in particular, there's this aspect of the industry that's producing educational giveaways. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. But while this is going on, around the same time, environmental education is becoming more of a formalized educational approach. And right about the same time, you have the maritime governments. Just in case we have anybody from the US here, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and some of the eastern provinces of Canada. They're also developing, social services are becoming much more something that a lot of citizens are expecting. Healthcare is coming online. So there's states, governments are looking for sources of revenue to help pay for that. They're trying to find out cost sharing agreements with the feds. You're also seeing a lot of interest in sort of industrialization in the 60s and 70s, trying to get the sort of economic base in the Maritimes built up, trying to create better opportunities across the board for citizens. And a lot of this is based on natural resources, because that's what we have. Not a lot of manufacturing necessarily, secondary manufacturing, but a lot of natural resources. And the example here is New Brunswick. This is Fraser Pulp Mill around late 1940s, 1950. And you can see the sort of the impact that had on the environment of itself. We got a lot of really good photos of piles of pulp by mills that I like to use when I publish stuff and all that. So these maritime governments are trying to develop their resources on a much grander scale, using New Brunswick, for example, pulp and paper. The pulp and paper mills in New Brunswick basically double in the 1960s. And by about 1970, there were 11 mills across the province owned by 10 companies. So there's this huge expansion of resource usage that's occurring, and the impact and the scale is quite grand compared to what came before. And right around the same time, of course, we have the rise of the environmental movement, and this awareness amongst the general population, greater awareness of sort of the impact of humans on the environment, ecologies coming around, post-Second World War, economic growth that's occurring, the sort of the impact from that is becoming much more aware. It's one thing if they're dumping sludge or whatever it is far away from you, but then all of a sudden, if it starts to appear in the creek behind your house, it all of a sudden becomes much more of a real world thing to you, and you become much more concerned about that. And so that's occurring more and more. In New Brunswick, for example, the sort of forest management, the sort of the state of the forest wasn't really a big issue at a popular level till about the later 70s, getting into the 80s. But in the sort of the 50s and the 60s, the two big issues are still related to forestry, are spraying for spruce budworm using DDT, and also effluents from pulp mills. And that is related to sort of the state and the quality of water. So those are sort of the big issues in New Brunswick. And with the rise of the environmental movement and environmental awareness, we have this new approach to education called environmental education. And it wasn't without, just keeping an eye on my time, it wasn't without precedent. It's related, it has it's related to sort of outdoor recreation movements and sort of middle class approaches to the environment and increase access to it, nature study programs for the early 20th century, those sorts of things. But the person who's widely credited with being the first person that give it a formal definition is this fellow here, William B. Stapp at the University of Michigan. In the later 60s, him and some of his colleagues and some of his grad students provided sort of the first formal definition of what environmental education was to them. And so for Stapp and his colleagues, environmental education programs, quote, should be aimed at producing a citizenry that is knowledgeable concerning the biophysical environment and its associated problems, aware of how to help solve these problems, and motivated to work toward their solution. So it was really about educating citizens about this new thing that's called the environment at the time, environmentalism, and about ways in which we could actively try to solve the environmental problem, whatever it may be that's identified. And this all sounds wonderful and great. We'll get into a minute about how this gets a little bit of appropriated by some states. Environmental education becomes very influential after the later 60s. Once you get into the 1970s, it becomes something that becomes part of the US government. There's an Office of Environmental Education that's put in place. There are major international conferences in places like Stockholm, etc. It's even taken up by UNESCO. Here's a screenshot that I have of the current United States Environmental Protection Agency. Environmental education is still featured on their website. Questionable to what degree it's being practiced under the current administration, but it's at least there on the website. So environmental education in the 70s really, it gained this sort of, this, I don't want to say notoriety, but an influence on the international and national scene. This brings us to the Maritimes. In the later 60s, the maritime governments were starting to talk about maritime union again, something they've been talking about every once in a while since the 19th century. And the sort of Council of Maritime Premiers is something that comes out of that, that's still around. It's now the Council of Atlantic Premiers. And one of the sort of first sub-councils that they developed in the early 70s is the Committee of the Environment. And that just goes to show to the degree to which environmental awareness and environmental issues at the sort of citizenry level was at such a degree that, these fellows in government started paying attention and responding to the interests and demands of citizens. Oops. I'm going to go there, yeah. So they were really interested in developing greater environmental awareness, and they actually started developing an environmental education program. I guess we'll go there. And one of the ways in which they were trying to get out the sort of environmental awareness as part of this education program was using comic books. And the comic books were part of teaching kits that they would give to teachers in school that were had posters, that had pamphlets, that had comic books so that the kids would have something to read for a bit. And the comic book was produced by this person here, Owen McCarron. He had one of two educational giveaway production companies in the 60s, 70s, 80s, thereabouts. One was in Toronto. McCarron was in Halifax. And McCarron was really, did some work for the big, like Marvel, for the big guys a little bit. And he did some work with the Halifax Chronicle Herald, related to advertising. So he took his love for comics, his entrepreneurial spirit, his experience with advertising, and he put it into this sort of giveaway company. And it brings me back to this. I didn't realize until just a few years ago, that the photo that I had seen originally was actually material from the teaching kit that they would have given to teachers themselves. So in the background here, you see these are some of the posters they'd put up in classrooms that don't litter, some of the pamphlets, and then also Captain Enviro, the comic book that they produced. Now, this should have occurred to me years ago, but for some reason, it just kind of one day hit me, and I was like, oh, this is actually the teaching kit. So one of those nerdy moments when you're like, aha, there's a sort of an aha moment there for you. Now, this all sounds great, right? That they're kind of responding to the moment, the time, they're responding to citizens' concerns about the environment. But for me, I don't really see it as, it's really not so much a noble-minded project. Um, as I mentioned earlier, these were governments at the time that were really pushing for sort of economic diversification, pushing for greater, larger usage of resources on an industrial scale, to help pay for new expanded social services, etc. And they were very much concerned that certain aspects of this new environmental movement that's now existing in the 60s and 70s, some of it was kind of radical. It was kind of subversive and really questioning the underpinnings of sort of North American capitalist society. And they were really concerned, some of them were anyway, about the ways in which that might affect the bottom line, the sort of the way that they were developing the economy in the 50s, 60s, leading into the 70s. So it's really kind of questioning the sort of the underpinning of the maritime economy in general. And you kind of see this in some of the evidence that I was able to get in the archives. And I want to thank Joanna Atonker, can never remember how to pronounce her last name, at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, because she really helped me sort through a lot of material. Back in the day, a lot of this stuff had not been organized like Richard Hatzfield's papers. Maybe they're better now. But everyone, thank your archivists and thank your librarians. We wouldn't be able to do anything without them. Here's a quote from an April 1971 communique from the Committee of Environment Ministers to the Council of Maritime Premiers. Quote, "It is important that the public be educated to the true facts of the pollution problem as opposed to the scare propaganda which is so common today." And this helps kind of bring in the idea that they were really interested, this is when they were developing the teaching kits and developing the environmental education program. This really brings around this idea of, they want to get across the true facts as at least they saw them or how they were framing it, to the pollution problem, as opposed to the scare propaganda. Some of the other sort of the messaging that was out there, some of the stuff that they saw as being maybe a little bit too radical. This sort of language appears again in meeting minutes from the Committee of the Environment Ministers from July 1975, when they're making reference to how the teaching kits could be used, the way in which they, being the teaching kits, may be used in classrooms to give students a better understanding of the environment, and the need for conservation and preservation without the use of the scare technique. I like that one, the scare technique, whatever that is. So you can really kind of see that there was, in their discussion about the developing of this education program, the developing of these teaching kits, there was an awareness amongst these government officials, these policymakers, of trying to develop a message that fit what they were interested in getting across. And to a large degree, it was something that was not quite as radical as what certain elements of the environmental movement supposedly was preaching. But it wasn't, way over here, right wing as well. It was more of they were trying to thread the needle. They were trying to develop a message that would satisfy enough concern amongst the general citizenry so that they could kind of quell some of the environmental awareness or distrust that was out there. But at the same time, not get a message across that that wouldn't, put a message out there that would create sort of distrust of the economic system in general. So they were trying to balance that, if that makes any sense. So to kind of get at the sort of the nuance there that they were really trying to get out to the citizens, let's spend the last, we got 8 minutes or so here, looking at Captain Enviro itself. So Captain Enviro is this comic book that was produced by the Committee of Environment Ministers with Owen McCarron at Comic Book World, and it likely would have been a back and forth process. John Bell likes to say that for a lot of the educational giveaways for the time, Comic Book World produced some pretty good content. The storylines were fairly solid for educational giveaways. They were quite colorful. The drawings were fairly well done. Nowhere near as good as some of the big guys, maybe some of the DCs or your Marvels, but for government produced comics, they were fairly well done. And here, Captain Enviro starts on the planet Poluto, and the people who live there are the Pollutions. Now, if you enjoy any sort of punny humor, this is great stuff. And the planet Poluto, for whatever reason, seems to be cleaning itself up, and they need to find a new place to go and pollute and develop as a new homeworld, a new place for them to live. And here, King Sewage III sends out his officers sludge, smog, and slime from the Royal Pollution Filth Force. And the place that they identify where they're going to go and land and try to develop as their new home territory or whatever just happens to be the beautiful maritime provinces in Canada, of course. Right, where else are they going to go? Everybody wants to go to the Maritimes. And it's fantastic. They actually land outside of Fredericton, and Captain Enviro is talking to a classroom in PEI or in Charlottetown, so he flies back. So it's got all this sort of these great local references if you ever a chance to check it out. So the pollutions arrive, and then it's all about how Captain Enviro is battling the pollutions throughout this comic book. Now, there's really about 5 components to the environmental message that's contained within this comic book. First of all, there's the comic book medium itself. I think it's kind of savvy of these government officials at the time to recognize that this is a medium that's popular with children or youth. So they kind of grab onto that popularity. 60s, 70s superhero comics are in their silver age in the U.S., and they're having a huge rise due to the work of people like Jack Kirby, etc. So they grab onto this medium itself and the popularity of it to try to get across their message. So they're using that as a way to try to get at the youth. The other component is that they really develop it with a lot of wholesome content. So there was a huge backlash to comic books in the later 40s and the 50s. There's a huge anti-comics backlash. It was kind of like sort of gangsta rap music in the 90s. Everybody was concerned about that. It might be, sort of polluting the minds of youth, no pun intended. And so in the 50s, it was comic books. And there were certain instances where if kids were playing with guns and they shot them off, and if somebody got hurt or something, they would then go to their rooms. And of course, kids had comic books in the rooms, and they'd kind of put one and one together and say, "Oh, the comic books, oh, they're polluting their minds." So I think these government officials, to a certain degree, would have recognized that issue. This was, the sort of comics backlash had a lot of international press. So there's really an effort there, I think, to make sure that there is wholesome content in here. If you see on the left-hand side, there's really no overt violence. It's more of, there's the sort of actions done kind of with these old Batman sort of glop, splot, whack sort of things. And on the right-hand side, there's actually a sort of an anti-drug message to Captain Enviro as well, where at one point they give him a magic mind pollutant, and then he goes on this sort of littering spree out of control, sort of what's that? I can't remember the name of the film right now, but from the 1930s, where everybody's smoking pot and they're like committing murder and stuff. So that had that sort of same message where, drugs are bad. And then the third part of this message, as I see it, is Captain Enviro as a superhero. Superheroes were, we kind of think of them as, oh, well, they're, whatever. But superheroes had a really sort of, there's a lot of cultural importance to them. And there's a scholar by the name of Christopher Murray, and he likens superhero comics to sort of like wartime propaganda in a way. And here's a quote that I'll read. Like superhero comics, the function of wartime propaganda was to make its audience recognize certain values and endeavors as heroic, and therefore admirable, and to submit to certain modifications of behavior or belief. One of the easiest and most efficient ways to do this was to offer the audience a model of behavior, usually in the figure of a hero with whom the audience could identify. So using Captain Enviro as this environmental superhero was really holding him up as this sort of, extreme model of behavior, the way you should be acting when it comes to regards to the environment. And he was easily identified as a superhero. He had this sort of slick sanitation uniform outfit. He had the helmet with the E chevron, etc. On the other side of that is the pollutions. They are the supervillains. They are the ones who are modeling behavior that you should not be doing, right? If the superhero is the sort of the good guy, the model of behavior that you should be doing, supervillains are the opposite of that. And that's who the pollutions are. And also, they kind of, in an extent, provide this sort of process of othering, right? And they take it in this case to the extreme. They are actually aliens, so they're this other from outside of the planet who land on Earth and do all these dastardly deeds. And in a way, it's sort of pointing out the ill effects of pollution and those sorts of things without actually pointing directly at the reader as well. It's saying this is just not things that you should be doing. And then finally, what kind of underpins all of this is that within the comic as a whole, the framing of how we should move forward, the sort of the environmental education message that comes across is the individual as solution. And there's no real focus on larger structural problems in society. So the general message is, and it comes across through quotes, through the general framing of the book as a whole. It comes from a you can help solve sort of kind of Q&A portion in the middle of the comic. There's no real focus on the sort of broader, structural elements that come with sort of environmental problems. The framing is that if you as an individual do your bit, all these bits added up will somehow lead to a better environmental future. And one of the sort of things that they put forward, for example, is like recycling. And they keep talking about that. Well, recycling is at the end of the production process, right? That's like after all of the other stuff has occurred and allowed markets to do their thing and all that stuff. But there's no discussion of, what comes at the other end, maybe less packaging, for example. So it really is this sort of, they're presenting a message of, yes, we need to do more to try to help solve the pollution problem, et cetera. But the real framing of it is that we need to do it more as individuals. And it's not really about, sort of structural change. And I think that's, it's to me, the way you can just take a comic book and get at some of that nuance of that message. And it's there in the 70s, kind of goes away, this sort of environmental education, a little bit in the 80s during the sort of rise of neoliberalism and everything. But then about 1990-ish onward, you see these programs really appearing in schools again. And that has to do with 1990 being the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. And people really then focus their attention again. They're like, wait a minute, it's been 20 years since we've had this thing called Earth Day. What have we really accomplished? And then these environmental education programs appear in school again. But by and large, I think that messaging that had been kind of worked out in the previous era is reappearing again, and I think is still around. Now, does that mean that all environmental education programs are, trying to usurp the youth or whatever? No, not at all. I think there's a lot of, goodwill, good intention there for sure. But I think there is an element, particularly when self-interested governments are in place, that we need to be aware of. All right, I'll try to stop there.
Thanks, Mark. That was super interesting. I'm just going to stop recording.
This video was published by the nbmediacoop.org in New Brunswick, Canada.